In this lecture, I'd like to continue with the theme in the rules of discernment that I was talking about in the last lecture on where we are weak, where the enemy of our human nature finds the weak spot in our fortifications, to use Ignatius's metaphor. And also to continue with the theme of the general congregation. Specifically, I'd like to talk about the second and third general congregations today. Again, the general congregations offer us a really privileged way of thinking about discernment because they are this great example of how we discern in common some of the more important decisions in the society and how we come together from all over this different parts of the society in order to do this. So I'd like to continue to talk about how this reveals both our strengths and our weaknesses, and continue with this theme of how to preserve the spirit of St. Ignatius, which sort of plagues us, makes us worry a lot in various times throughout the history of the society, and certainly worried us in the years that were very close to when Ignatius actually died. So the first general congregation, as you'll recall, happened in 1558 when there were about 1,000 Jesuits in the world. The second general congregation happens in 1565, and there are already 3,500 Jesuits. So big growth in those years, not the fastest growth in the history of all religious orders, but sometimes we can make claims like that are not true. No, we weren't the fastest religious order to ever grow, but we did grow quickly. And then when we're talking about, and that's the one who elected, that general congregation in 1565 elected Francis Borgia. And the third general congregation happened in 1573 when there were about 3,905 Jesuits, and that elected Everard Mercurian. And the membership of the general congregations went from around 21 voting members to around 39 to around 47 in those years. So just to give you kind of a brief kind of statistical overview, I'm not a huge one for statistics, but they can be helpful. So when Diego Lainez dies in 1565, they called the second general congregation. Again, we know how the votes were distributed. And we know that Francis Borgia was elected with 31 of the 39 votes of the delegates on the very first ballot. So there was not much controversy about his election at all. People seemed agreed after they'd gone through that prayerful process of discernment. Just a very brief few notes that I want to make about the second general congregation. The second general congregation passes over 120 degrees. Again, they are quite boring to read, although fascinating to me, but they are very legislative and very nitpicky. And there's some interesting things that are decided at the second general congregation. The second general congregation decides to establish a novitiate in every province. So the earliest recruits to the society, the earliest people who joined after the first companions, did not have formal novitiates. You take somebody like Peter Canisius, he took his first vows within days of finishing the spiritual exercises. He made the spiritual exercises within days of hearing that the Jesuits existed and meeting Pierre Fabre, with whom he took them, with whom he made the exercises, that is, excuse me. Others did very similar things in those days, and there was not a lot of regulation about this. And originally, novices were just sort of living in the ordinary houses of the society. In Messina, where the first Jesuit college was founded in 1548, as they got more and more people who wanted to enter the society, they came up with this idea that maybe we should have a separate house for these people's for the novices formation, and that's the first novitiate, which is founded in 1550. This decree in 1565 at the second general congregation universalizes that decree, that decision to make the novitiates a separate and always to have the novices separated from the fathers for their formation. There's a lot of good in this decision because obviously it's a different life learning how to be a Jesuit than than the ordinary life of the society. Although there are probably some negative motivations mixed in with this too. You were probably, like I, when you were a novice, subjected to hearing a lot of things about, oh, I don't want to scandalize you. When you would meet older Jesuits, they'd talk about this. And there's this real concern among Jesuits then, and maybe still among Jesuits now, that if novices are living in ordinary houses of society, they'll be scandalized and they'll lose their holiness or their innocence or their purity. This is a strange concern and a strange reason to found novitiates. But it does get at, again, this existential angst that we sometimes have in the Jesuits, which is our life is not very typically religious. The most typically religious life we lead as Jesuits is in the novitiate. It's the most monastic. It's the most like other religious orders, where we have a lot more things in common, where we have a lot more structure. We lose a lot of that structure deliberately after the novitiate because of our availability. We can't have the same kind of structures, and these structures are supposed to be internalized so that we have a regular pattern of prayer, and we're faithful in our vows and all these other things like that. But the novitiate is different because we're learning how to do it. The question is, was part of the motivation for making sure that every province had a novitiate, was it just for the utility that this would be a good way to train novices, or is this because we're worried about sort of infecting novices with the lax way the Jesuits live? There's some angst about this. Are we being good religious? Is an angst that plagues us as Jesuits and that comes up a lot at the general congregations. We need to separate the novices from fathers in this particular case. This is also the congregation that establishes, the Second General Congregation establishes the Congregation of Procurators. The Congregation of Procurators is held, originally it was every 3 years in between general congregations. So general congregations are not held at intervals, right? They're held either when a general dies or when a general resigns. Or when a general, or when they're called for matters of greater moment, big issues that we have to decide in the history of the society, in the life of the society, excuse me. And this makes us different from other religious orders because it means we don't have a regular universal chapter. So again, Jesuit distinctiveness raises its head. The congregation of the Second General Congregation was worried, well, maybe we should be like other religious and have regular general congregations. And so there was this fight over whether this was a betrayal of Ignatius's legacy, whether we needed to do something like this, whether this would make us better religious, whether this would make us less available, and all of this kind of struggle and angst over this question. The Congregation of Procurators was the compromise decision. The Congregation of Procurators only has one legislative authority. The only real legislative power that they have is to force the superior general to call a general congregation. So the idea was, originally it was every 3 years. Now they're a little bit more infrequent because we also have something called the Congregation of Provincials. But in between general congregations, every 3 years, the idea was the Congregation of Procurators, one representative of every province would get together and they would vote whether we should call a general congregation. So this was to sort of have a little bit something more like the other religious orders having a chapter, but we limited its authority to stay true to the vision of St. Ignatius, sort of a compromise decision. Obviously, the Congregation of Procurators has also, as time has gone on, grown into a great consultative body. That's certainly how more recent generals like Father Sosa have used the Congregation of Procurators as a way to consult the universal society and to consult the non-provincials, because provincials are not procurators. It's a different take on the society, but it did come in part out of this angst about, oh, this makes us different. Do we want the things that make us different, or do we need to be more like other religious? This question of our distinctiveness, which is our strength, also is so often the cause of our weaknesses. It can feel like a weakness, and it's the cause of a lot of controversy. It's something I want to draw attention to. And the third thing that was a Second General Congregation did to make us better religious was legislation on prayer. So Ignatius was very insistent, again, because of his desire to make us available, that the professed fathers would not have a requirement of prayer except for their obligations as priests in terms of the liturgy of the hours and Mass, and their obligations as Jesuits would just be to their 2 examens every day. There would be no requirement beyond the examens for meditative, contemplative, quiet, mental prayer, whatever the word you want to use for it is. Jesuits in formation, scholastics, and brothers in formation would be required to have an additional time. They would have an hour of prayer. That's in the norms, in the constitutions. The novices have a little bit more, scholastics have a little bit less than novices, but there are requirements for meditation. But Ignatius's idea was that by the time you were professed, you would want to pray. You would want to pray. So he was not expecting that the professed would not pray. Rather, he was saying the professed should not be obliged to pray, because for one thing, they need to be able to suit their prayer, to adapt it to the circumstances that they're in. And for another thing, they don't need an obligation, because by the time they are professed, they are so immersed in the charism of what it means to be a Jesuit. They know that they need prayer in order to live this life. And so we don't need to impose a requirement upon them. That in fact, by the time you are professed, Ignatius's vision was that your life would be rooted in actual prayer, but also be prayerful in a very important way. And so this obligation didn't make any sense to Ignatius. Ignatius was loath to impose a lot of undue obligations on Jesuits, because he wanted Jesuits to be available and to take personal responsibility for their prayer and their life, and even the missions that they were given, that are given. This is Ignatius's vision, and it made us different from other religious. It made people think, oh, well, then people aren't going to pray. Probably still to this day, there are Jesuits who feel that way. Well, at the Second General Congregation, they were arguing about whether they should impose a set amount of meditation, silent prayer, mental prayer, on everyone in the society, not just people in formation, but also the professed. And they decided that there was controversy about it, but they decided not to decide, but to give the general the authority to lengthen the amount of prayer. And then basically, as soon as Francis Borgia had the authority to impose a longer period of prayer on all the professed, he did. And he imposed an hour of prayer, of mental prayer, in addition to the examens and liturgy, on every Jesuit. And that was ratified at a later congregation, and that was the law of the society, therefore, from 1565, when Francis Borgia was elected general, until this 31st General Congregation in 1965, which decided to revert us to the original practice of St. Ignatius, as described in the constitutions. So angst, existential angst, these things that make us different as Jesuits, are they good things or are they bad things? The length of time in general, novices being exposed to sort of the the less structured form of religious life, and then this question of the less structured form of our prayer, the less obligatory nature of the personal prayer the Jesuits engage in. All things that made us worried, and we see pretty much, we're not very far out from the death of St. Ignatius. Ignatius dies in 1556. This is 1565, and things are already changing to make us more like other religious. This is a worry. And again, is that the way to preserve the Institute? Is that the way to stay true to Ignatius? Are we adapting to needs that we see, or and therefore living out of the spirit of St. Ignatius, or are we adapting in ways that don't live out of the spirit of what Ignatius envisioned, and sort of are we betraying things that are important to the distinctiveness of how we are supposed to be available to Christ and Christ's church? Things to consider, things that I invite you to consider, because that's the discernment lesson, right? The discernment lesson is all about, well, so what were the spirits that were motivating the society at this time? This is not easy discernment, because obviously praying is a good thing. We're not talking about a bad thing, that prayer, but the question is whether the imposition of prayer, from what spirit did it proceed? Was it a spirit of fear, or was it a spirit of freedom? Third General Congregation is the second and last topic I want to talk about in this lecture. Francis Borgia dies in 1572, and the Third General Congregation meets the next year in 1573. There is there's some angst as the society has become more universal, as more and more people have joined. There's some angst in the society about whether there's too much too much of a Spanish flavor to the society. Yes, the whatever you want to call it, but prejudice, national prejudice, let's say, rears its ugly head in the society, particularly from France and Italy. They're sort of like, well, not only have all the generals been from the Iberian Peninsula, but most of their counselors, most of their assistants, most of their secretaries, everybody, the society is dominated by Spaniards, and this isn't a good thing, especially because those Spaniards, they're way too strict. They're just not understanding and moderate the way the French are or the Italian are, whatever the case might be. I'm not saying that's true. I'm saying those are the sort of prejudices that came in. And there's also an unrest that's growing internal to the society over new Christians. If you're not familiar with the term new Christians is an awful euphemism. New Christians is to describe Christians, Catholics, who come from somehow from Muslim or Jewish origins. The idea is that if you are a member of a family that within 2 generations converted from either Islam or Judaism to Christianity, you are a new Christian. Now, that's obviously ridiculous. You were born into a Christian family, your parents were Christian, you are not a new Christian just because your grandfather had converted. What's the origin of the prejudice? Well, the origin of the prejudice, in theory, they're saying, well, they're not necessarily, maybe they converted for bad reasons and they're not sincere in their Christianity and we have to be distrustful of them. What it really comes down to, of course, is a fairly racist prejudice because, how are they even tracing who comes from Muslim and Jewish origin? It's really kind of, it's sort of a xenophobic attitude that was particularly prominent on the Iberian Peninsula at this time. And there's this real concern with purezza de sangre, purity of blood. This is a very un-Christian attitude and a real problem. And we're going to see it rear its ugly head, even in a much more tragic way at the 5th General Congregation. But at this General Congregation, it's in the air, and there's particularly concern over the fact that everyone seems to be certain that Juan de Polanco, who's been the secretary of the society since the time of Ignatius, he was secretary of society under Ignatius, Lainus, and Borgia, and everyone seems to know, is a new Christian, that he comes from Jewish stock originally. And he's also been in governance for a long time, so he's had time to make enemies among the society because he's been in power for a long time in a position of great influence. And he seems to be the likeliest candidate to be elected general. So another Spaniard who's a new Christian who's been in governance for a long time. And so there's all this angst and unrest about the possibility of a generalate headed by, of Polanco's generalate. And the unrest in the society, unfortunately, as has happened far too many times in the history of the society, ropes in people in the papal curia and comes to the ears of the Pope. The way that we solve our problems, and the way we have too often solved our problems by resorting instead of to fraternal conversation, but to external pressures, is not one of our finer the finer aspects of our history. Not something to be proud of, but something that is real. Pope Gregory the 13th has heard about this unrest, and he gets Alessandro Farnese, the Farnese family, the sponsors of the Jesuits, and they're great friends of the society, the Church of the Jesuits, the major benefactors. The Pope sends Alessandro Farnese to talk to Polanco, and he says, the Pope doesn't want, Farnese says to Polanco, excuse me, I'm making this confusing. The Pope says to Polanco, the Pope doesn't want, Farnese says to Polanco, the Pope does not want a Spaniard to be general of the Society of Jesus. So the Pope, before the election has occurred, before the congregation has occurred, is interfering in the election and saying, yeah, you can elect anyone you want as long as it's not a Spaniard. Well, Polanco says, that's problematic. That's limiting our freedom. And he decides, this was done casually. It wasn't done officially. I'm going to ignore it. So he doesn't tell anyone about the visit because he thinks this is going to ruin the election and the freedom of our election. 3 days after the congregation starts, the congregation goes to sends a delegation to get the blessing of the Pope, and the Pope asks about procedures of the congregation. He also says, how many of the delegates of the general congregation are Spaniards? The answer, by the way, is one short of the majority. And the Pope asks, and how many Spaniards have been generals of the Society of Jesus? And he asks specifically about whether there are any non-Spaniard candidates for general. And he mentions specifically Everard Mercurian as a possibility. He's a Belgian. Okay, so the Pope is interfering in the election in kind of a soft power sort of way. And eventually, as you can read about in John O'Malley's article on all of this, there's this big fight in which the Pope gets eventually commands the general congregation to not elect a Spaniard, and then the Jesuits go back and get the Pope to agree to withdraw that. And so eventually, by the time the election happens, the Jesuits have been ordered to, and they've been influenced and all these sorts of things. But in theory, by the time the election happens, the Jesuits are at the General Congregation are free to elect whoever they want. And in that great freedom, they can elect whoever they want, and there's no papal interference. They elect exactly the person that the Pope wanted. They elect Everard Mercurian. They elect the first non-Spaniard general, exactly the person that the Pope had mentioned. There are plenty who do vote for Spanish candidates at the congregation, so it's not as if some people didn't take the Pope at his word, but I think it's pretty clear that there's some real papal interference here. And I think it's important to know that the papal interference started with internal angst within the society that we spoke very loudly about and involved people outside of the society. And so this question of prejudice and this question of the society not always being great about it, solving its problems internally and fraternally becomes influential in the election of a good man. Everard Mercurian is a good man and a good general and has been a Jesuit for a long time. That's not the issue. The issue is that we're starting to see the limits of our freedom and the human flaws of the society interfering with the exercise of the supreme legislative body of the society, the general congregations. So yeah, Mercurian's elected with 27 of the 47 votes. 13 of those votes were for Spaniards, so some people took the Pope at his word. I want to just highlight 3 of the decrees of the Third General Congregation, just to explore some of these themes just a little bit more. So, as you'll recall from General Congregation 1, first there is the election of the general. Then they go kind of about the ordinary business of the congregation. So here's I just want to read and comment on 3 of the decrees. So, Decree 21: can the professed of 3 vows or the non-professed be superiors of the professed of 4 vows? Such members, whether they are professed of 3 vows or non-professed, when they are rectors or ministers, supposing that they are priests, can and even should exercise authority over the professed of 4 vows, so live among them, or even those who are visiting. They are well on a journey according to the mandate of the common rule. Again, these latter are obliged to show obedience and subjection to the former under the common order and regulations of the places where the former reside. So there was angst in the society about whether being solemnly professed of 4 vows, having the 4th vow to the Pope for missions, meant that you could not be subject to someone who had not professed vows or had professed 3 vows, who were spiritual coadjutors. In other words, the concern is that, well, these are more fully Jesuits, and so they're better Jesuits, and so why should they have to be under obedience to someone who is, a lesser Jesuit? This is the wrong way to think about grades in the society. This is not Ignatius's vision of grades in the society. There's lots of controversy and opinion about grades, but certainly grades are not saying that a superior is not a superior. That's what this decree is about. This decree is saying if he's the superior, it doesn't matter what kind of vows he has. He's the superior and we owe obedience to him. That's the way the governance works in the society. But what we're seeing is controversy coming in about the uniqueness of this structure in the society, where some are professed to four vows and some are not. And so we see this concern about precedents in the society and who are the real Jesuits. And again, this Ignatius has this, the constitutions established this, something unique about the Jesuits, that there are these different ways of being a Jesuit. And there's worry among people about what that means, and it leads to infighting. Okay, the 23rd decree. Some fathers had proposed for discussion whether the constitutions, which because of the times or other reasons are not being served, ought to be expunged. The response was that in no way should this be done. Rather, it is necessary that all of them remain untouched so that they may be handed on to our successors exactly as they were received from our Reverend Father Ignatius. Nevertheless, a notation is to be made along with a reason why a congregation judged that such constitutions ought no longer to be observed. Okay, so what's talking about here is there's concern is, well, if something in the constitutions isn't being observed, should we just get rid of it? And what the decree decides is, well, even if there's an abrogation of a rule in the constitutions should be preserved in their entirety, just with a note that things are going to be that things have been abrogated by a general congregation, because they were written by Saint Ignatius. So again, this question of how do we stay true to Ignatius is becoming more and more answered as, to stay true to Ignatius is to stay true to the specific decisions that he made in the legislation that he made in the smallest letter. We need to preserve everything that he wrote. And I'm leave that out there. I leave that out there as something for you to consider. Is that the way? Is that the way to stay true to Ignatius and his vision of how we were to proceed as Jesuits? Last decree I just want to mention. After a daily schedule for novices had been read to the delegates, the congregation decreed that both the schedule and the delineation of the office of the Master of Novices should be remanded to Father General, insofar as both of these belong to regulations and the system of governing. The novitiates are starting to be legislated at a pretty high level. So the novitiates, having gone from sort of being informal to, at the second congregation, being every province has one, now we've got the general congregations themselves are being asked to legislate on the novitiates. But this general congregation decided that they would not legislate on the novitiates, that they would let the Father General make the ultimate decision about the daily order and other things in the novitiates. What we're seeing is another creep that goes on at the highest level of governance in the society, namely the creep toward micromanagement, the creep toward the general congregation deciding the minutiae of Jesuit life. And again, the question is this in accord with our way of proceeding? We have to make small decisions as Jesuits, but should we be legislating them from above when part of the spirit of our society is we need to be flexible and adaptable enough in order to respond to the greatest needs as they come up in our service of Christ in Christ's church? So there are tensions, and these tensions are played out in the discernments that happen at the general congregations. There are tensions about how do we stay true to who we are? How do we be religious? How do we preserve the legacy of St. Ignatius? And these are weak points that are going to plague us as Jesuits for our whole history. We worry about what it means to be Jesuits. And even though we love the society, we worry that maybe we've gone too far in some respect, or maybe we're not as good a religious as we're supposed to be. And there's all this sort of existential angst that's happened since the earliest part of the society. And the question we need to ask ourselves is, does this angst come from a good spirit of self-reflection and self-examination? Or does it come from an evil spirit that's tempting us on our weak point? The fact that we are adaptable makes us think, well, maybe then we're too adaptable. Or maybe we don't have any principles that we stand for. Is that the evil spirit talking? Or is that the good spirit inviting us to self-reflection? These are important questions that are raised, I think, by this part of our history. And I leave them to you to explore further. But I offer them to you as, I think, an important lesson in sort of the internal discernments, the internal communal discernments of the Society of Jesus. Thank you.